Now, the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump on Saturday night took place within a long and much broader context of violence which threatens the highest office in America and those who seek to fill it. Reporter Simon Tierney has been investigating these events and examining how they affect campaign outcomes. Simon, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
The pictures of a bloodied Trump ducking bullets at the weekend, I'm afraid, is an all too familiar image in presidential history.
Yeah, there's something ghoulish, of course, about the history of assassination attempts in America in a political context because, of course, these candidates are filmed everywhere they go. Everything is scrutinized. So it's inevitable that they're going to be caught on camera. Pat, so we have an extraordinary archive of how they play out, and I've no doubt at all that the picture of Trump raising his fist in defiance, blood dripping down his face, it was taken by Evan Vucci, who is with the Associated Press. That's going to be immortalized within this canon. Now, the most infamous assassination attempt on the campaign trail, and one which, of course, was cruelly successful, was that of Bobby Kennedy, who was running on the Democratic ticket in 1968, Pat, just 5 years after his brother John had been assassinated.
Had won an impressive victory over Senator McCarthy, but that victory soon turned to tragedy as the senator appeared in the embassy room of the Ambassador Hotel, naturally to meet his cheering fans. There was quite a bit of commotion, as might be expected. Many of the people there thought that this was merely another display of the ardor of the Kennedy fans who had followed his campaigning all the way along, and they were dumbfounded when it was clear what had happened. Shots had rang out. The senator had been wounded. Several other people on the platform, at least 3 at last count, had also been wounded in an exchange of gunfire, not an exchange, an unknown assailant.
And Senator Robert Kennedy would die the morning after that bulletin on CBS News from injuries sustained after Sirhan shot him. Another major assassination attempt took place in the 1970s. What happened to the infamous politician George Wallace?
Yeah, so George Wallace, Pat, was a committed segregationist, the governor of Alabama, famously petitioning against the racial integration of the university system and the school system in southern states. And he was what would have been described as a Dixie Democrat. And I think sometimes we forget that the Democratic Party, particularly in the former Confederate states, had a very deeply racist faction to it, something that Lyndon Johnson had to fight against constantly. And less than a decade before his campaign for president, he'd famously declared, quote unquote, "I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever."
And there's an echo of history between this 2024 campaign and the platform that George Wallace was running on in 1972, isn't there?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this last night, Pat, because the current Vice President, Kamala Harris, when she was running for the presidency in the last election in 2020 against her current boss, she, of course, talked about her own experience of busing when she was a little girl in California, growing up there. Now, in May 1972, when Wallace was out greeting a crowd at a mall in Maryland, he was approached by a 21-year-old by the name of Arthur Bremer, and he was shot 4 times in the abdomen. Now, one of those bullets lodged in his spinal cord, and Wallace survived, but he was paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life.
Beaming approval from behind dark glasses, Bremer applauds enthusiastically as Wallace addresses a rally in Silver Spring, Maryland. Then, as the governor of Alabama moves out to press flesh with his followers, a hand pokes a gun through the crowd. Wallace survives the assassination attempt, but his wounds leave him paralyzed, forcing the end of his active campaign.
So George Wallace did survive that attempt, but what effect did the assassination attempt have on his campaign?
Well, massively more so than I think it'll affect this campaign with what happened to Trump on Saturday night. You know, Wallace had chronic pain, a convalescence period extended. It made it difficult for him to remain competitive. And despite winning a further 2 primaries after the assassination attempt, he lost the nomination to George McGovern, of course, who would then lose to President Richard Nixon. But he did win nearly a quarter of the votes, which just goes to show what America was like in the 70s.
Well, just 3 years later, the month is September 1975, and that proved to be an extraordinary one, with not one but 2 attempts on the life of President Gerald Ford.
Yeah, now I wasn't as familiar with the Gerald Ford case before I started researching this, Pat, but in the space of just 17 days, 2 separate assassins tried to take out President Gerald Ford. And he'd, of course, taken over as president after the resignation of Richard Nixon following the Watergate scandal. Now, intriguingly, the history of assassination in America inevitably tends to be predominantly male, but both of these attempts were carried out by women. Now, the first was committed by Lynette Fromm, and she was a member of the Manson family cult, a disciple of Charles Manson, and she confronted President Ford in Sacramento, the state capital of California. She cocked a pistol at him, pulled the trigger, but it failed to discharge, and she famously said, "It didn't go off. Can you believe it? It didn't go off," as she was tackled to the ground by the Secret Service heavies. Now, she was, I suppose we would describe as an eco-terrorist. She was attempting to draw attention to the pollution of the giant redwood forests of California through violent activism, which just goes to show the obtuse and kind of random motivations that a lot of these assassins have.
Now, it's hard to believe that the Secret Service would then have allowed anyone to get within reach of the president after this happened, but the fate came knocking on the door a second time.
Yeah, just 2 weeks later, the second attempt was undertaken by a woman called Sarah Jane Moore. Now, she shot at Gerald Ford as he came out of a building in San Francisco, Pat. She missed his head by 5 inches before she was tackled to the ground. She was sentenced to life in prison, but she later talked about what her motivation had been, which was a bit more generic than her predecessor. She said it was to ignite a violent revolution to create change in America, an idea that can be transplanted from generation to generation, I suppose. Now, we have some contemporary news footage in the aftermath of that second attempt on President Gerald Ford, September the 22nd, 1975.
The president is now on Air Force One, somewhere over the Midwest, a little more than an hour to go before he lands in Washington. Mr. Ford is all right. He had a close call in San Francisco earlier today when a 45-year-old woman, Sarah Moore, allegedly tried to shoot him. She will be arraigned in San Francisco within the hour in the attempted assassination. For details on what happened there, here is ABC White House correspondent Steve Bell.
It happened as the president was leaving the St. Francis Hotel after his last scheduled appearance. The president appeared stunned momentarily, but he was not hit. He was quickly pushed into a crouching position, into his limousine, and in moments the motorcade was underway, rushing away from the trouble area toward the airport. The hero of the hour, a San Francisco policeman named Joseph Curry. It was he who saw the gun in a woman's hands moments before she had a chance to fire. He struck her arm just as the gun went off, and the bullet crashed into the pavement.
The next, and the most recent before this one, the assassination attempt in 1981 on Ronald Reagan. That's the last major attempt, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is a lot more serious, the one that happened to Reagan. Pat, he was leaving a meeting with Labour leaders outside the Hilton Hotel in D.C. in March of 81. He was heading to the presidential limousine when John Hinckley Jr. approached him and shot him, but also his press secretary, a Secret Service agent, and a policeman. So 4 people were shot. Now, Reagan took a .22 caliber bullet to his left lung. He was bundled into the back of the limo and he was taken to hospital for a 2-hour surgery, which obviously he survived. This was at the very beginning of his presidency. But he was actually lucid in advance of the operation, and apparently he said to his wife from the gurney, "Sorry, honey, I forgot to duck."
And for those of you who are at this point expecting to see our regular evening news broadcast, we will take a moment to review the events of this day. At approximately 2:30 this afternoon, President Reagan was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel after giving a speech to the Building Trades Council of the AFL-CIO. You will see the president come out very shortly now. This is slow motion tape of his exit from the hotel. He comes out, he waves to the crowd across the driveway. Reporters call out questions to him, as is their custom. You'll see him turn now and look toward the reporters. And now the shots. In just this second. The agent in front of the president in the blue suit is hit, falls to the ground. The president, although we didn't know it at the time, also was hit in the left side of his chest. The police, who are swarming all over one man now, are after a man who has been identified as John Warnock Hinckley. He will be arraigned later tonight. He is 25 years old, we understand now. Earlier we thought he was 22.
Now, it's difficult to understand the motivations of these would-be assassins. The reasons are not clear-cut and straightforward opposition to the platform offered by the candidate, are they?
No, and the FBI are working furiously as we speak to try and ascertain what were the motivations of Trump's assassin, which will be interesting to find out, or attempted assassination, I should say. Now, John Hinckley Jr. was obsessed with the actress Jodie Foster. This is quite interesting, Pat, because what was the recent Martin Scorsese movie at that time, Taxi Driver, which had come out just a few years earlier, it deals with this character, Travis Bickle, if you remember, played by Robert De Niro, and his attempts to assassinate a US senator. And John Hinckley Jr. seems to have wanted to emulate that character's actions in real life. Then Arthur Bremer, George Wallace's assailant, who we talked about a few minutes ago, he had kept a so-called assassin's diary, which was later recovered by the police. And in it, he had written the following, Pat, quote unquote, "It is my personal plan to assassinate by pistol either Richard Nixon or George Wallace. I intend to shoot one or the other while he attends a campaign rally." He had thought about shooting Nixon, didn't get the opportunity, so then he went for Wallace. Interestingly, a copy of Bremer's diary was actually found among John Hinckley Jr.'s belongings. So there's this bizarre connection between two separate assassins. But Bremer, he wasn't trying to combat Wallace's ideology. He wanted to be famous or infamous, and he had fantasized in his own diary entries about how his assassination would be reported on the news.
Do we know what happened to all these would-be assassins?
I couldn't believe when I was concluding my research on this, Pat, because there's something eerie about this, but they're all still alive, even though we think of this as ancient kind of history. But just as Sirhan Sirhan, the assassin who murdered Bobby Kennedy, is still alive and still serving his prison sentence, he's been in prison for 56 years now since Bobby Kennedy died, so too are John Hinckley Jr., alive, I should say, Sarah Jane Moore, Lynette Fromm, Arthur Bremer, but the last four have been released and are living amongst Americans today.
Simon Tierney, a great report. Thank you very much for reminding us of political violence in the United States.